There is a document that ends a man's control over his own life. It is 2 pages long. It has a signature line at the bottom. It is called a power of attorney. Sylvan Moore signed one in a solicitor's office in Manila on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He believed he was simplifying his finances. He was handing over everything. This is the story of how a retired executive from London, a man who had spent 30 years managing other people's assets, was slowly, carefully, expertly convinced to stop managing his own. The afternoon I signed that document, Quinley made us tea. She did it in the small kitchen of the serviced apartment we shared in Bonifacio Global City. Put the kettle on, set out 2 cups, brought them to the table where I was sitting with the paperwork in front of me. It was such a domestic, ordinary thing, the kind of small gesture that a person makes when they live somewhere comfortably and expect to keep doing so. I remember thinking, watching her, that this was what a settled life looked like. Not grand, not dramatic, just 2 cups of tea, and a legal document, and a woman who moved through a shared space as if she belonged in it. I signed. She witnessed. We drank our tea. That was 14 months before I understood what I had actually done. To understand this properly, you need to know who I was before Manila, not who I became in it. That part you'll understand soon enough. But the man who arrived. I spent 31 years in corporate treasury management. I worked for a major financial services group in the City of London, and my job, in plain terms, was to protect money, to understand risk, to build structures that prevented assets from being exposed to threats that a less careful person might not see coming. I was not a flashy financier. I was the man who read the fine print, who asked the questions nobody wanted to ask because the answers might slow things down, who understood, at a level that most people never develop, that the greatest financial risks are not the obvious ones. They are the ones hidden inside something that looks completely routine. I retired at 68. My wife, Rosalind, had left 7 years before that. Not a dramatic departure, more a slow and mutual withdrawal that ended in a civilized agreement and the sale of our house in Putney. Our son, Oliver, lived in Edinburgh with his family. We were close in the way that fathers and adult sons are close, when there is love but not enough time or proximity to keep it daily. My daughter Miriam was in Melbourne and called every Sunday without fail, which I relied on more than I admitted. After retirement, I tried the expected things: travel, golf, a non-executive board position I lasted 9 months in before the meetings started to feel more draining than the work had ever been. I had more money than I needed, a generous final salary pension, substantial savings, and an investment portfolio that my former colleagues would have called conservatively managed, and I would have called appropriate for a man who had spent his career watching other people's recklessness destroy things they had built over decades. I was not lonely in any acute way. I was solitary. There is a difference. Lonely is a state that demands resolution. Solitary is a state that a certain kind of man learns to inhabit, like a house he's lived in for a long time. He knows where the drafts come from, and he's learned to sit away from them. But solitary, over years, becomes its own kind of erosion. And when I flew to Manila for the first time at 69, on the recommendation of a former colleague named Hugh Castleton, who had retired there and could not stop sending me photographs of warm evenings and reasonable restaurant bills, I was more ready for company than I had been willing to admit even to myself. I met Quinley Navarro at a financial industry networking event in Makati during my second week. Hugh had suggested I come along. "There are a lot of expat business people there," he said. "You'll find people to talk to, and it's better than sitting in the hotel." He was right on both counts. Quinley was 38 years old and worked in financial services, corporate treasury, specifically, which was the field I had spent my career in. She was with a mid-sized investment management firm in Makati, working in client account management. She was not the most striking person in the room. She was the sharpest. I noticed that within 10 minutes of conversation, the way she processed information, the precision of her language, the absence of the filler and approximation that most people use without noticing they're doing it. We talked about currency risk management for 40 minutes at a drinks event. I cannot tell you what that means to a retired treasury professional who has spent 18 months making conversation at golf clubs and charity dinners. It meant I was home. "You're not what I expected from a retired city man," she said at one point. "What did you expect?" I said. "Someone who talks about what he used to do, rather than what he still thinks about," she said. I laughed. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said about me in years. We exchanged cards. We had lunch the following week, and then dinner. And then, over the course of the next 3 months, during which I extended my stay in Manila twice, each time telling myself it was because the city interested me, rather than because she did, something developed that I had not planned for and did not entirely know how to categorize. It was not the frantic, overwhelming feeling of early romance. It was quieter than that. More like the slow recognition of a frequency you hadn't known you were tuned to. She was intelligent, careful, and had a kind of stillness about her that I associated with people who have learned to think before they speak. She laughed at things that were genuinely funny, rather than at things that were merely said with confidence, which distinguished her immediately from most of the professional world I had inhabited. She asked about my work with a genuine curiosity that went beyond polite interest. She asked about the structures I had built, the decisions I had been proudest of, the ones I had got wrong. Not many people ask about the ones you got wrong. It is a particular kind of question, one that assumes you are honest enough to have an answer, and capable enough to have learned from it. I told her about a currency hedge position I had misread in 2009, how I had been so confident in my model that I had not properly stress-tested it against an event I had judged too unlikely to weight heavily. The loss to the group had been contained, but meaningful. I had lost sleep over it for 3 months. "What did you learn?" she said. "That confidence is not the same as being right," I said, "and that the things you dismiss as unlikely are usually the things worth examining most carefully." She nodded slowly, as if filing something away. I thought she was learning from me. I did not consider that she might be learning about me. The relationship became clear. To both of us, formally, about 5 months in. She was not a woman who talked about feelings in the way that makes some men uncomfortable. She expressed them through action, through presence, through the particular attentiveness of someone who has decided that you matter. She remembered things. She followed up on things I had mentioned weeks earlier. When I had a cold during one of my extended Manila stays, she appeared at my hotel with medication and sat with me for 2 hours, and at no point made it feel like a performance. I came back to London twice over the following year, and came back to Manila 3 times. Each visit was longer. I was, by the second year, spending more time in Manila than in Putney. I had let the Putney flat go. I was barely using it. The costs were significant, and I had taken a longer-term lease on a serviced apartment in BGC that made more practical sense. Oliver called when I told him about the flat. "Dad," he said, "that's a permanent decision." "It's a sensible financial decision," I said. "I'm not talking about the finances," he said. I told him I was fine. I told him I had thought it through carefully, which was partially true in the financial sense, and not true at all in the personal one. I had not thought through the personal dimension at all. I had simply moved toward the thing that felt right, the way you do when you have been alone for long enough that the movement itself becomes the justification. The first financial conversation happened about 8 months into the relationship. It did not feel like a financial conversation. It felt like a practical one, which is a distinction worth understanding, because it is how certain conversations are made to feel benign when they are not. Quinley was helping me manage some of the practicalities of living between 2 countries. She had been helping in small ways for months, recommending services, translating documents, explaining local processes that I would have found opaque on my own. She was, professionally, exactly the right person to be doing this. A finance professional with deep local knowledge, someone who understood both the UK and Philippine financial environments. "One of the things that makes your situation complicated," she said one evening, "is the split between your UK accounts and your spending base here. You're losing money on every transfer through the exchange rate and the banking fees. There are more efficient structures available." She walked me through them. They were, as she described them, entirely legitimate. international account structures that minimized FX costs and made fund flows between jurisdictions cleaner. I followed everything she said. I had spent 30 years thinking about exactly these kinds of structures. None of it was technically wrong. What I did not pay sufficient attention to was the next part. The part where managing those structures required someone with local authority to act on my behalf quickly when needed. Because timing matters in FX, as I knew better than almost anyone, and where the most efficient way to enable that was a document that authorized Quinley to act as my representative in financial matters here in the Philippines. It's a standard instrument, she said, used all the time for expats with split financial lives. It just means I can execute on your behalf, without needing your physical signature every time, which matters when you're back in London and the window closes. A power of attorney, I said. A limited one, she said. Scope to the Philippine accounts and the FX arrangements we set up. Nothing touching your UK assets. I asked questions. She answered them. Correctly, specifically, with the fluency of someone who understood the instrument and its limitations. I had spent 30 years reading documents designed to deceive, and I read nothing in her answers that concerned me. The scope seemed defined. The rationale was sound. The efficiency argument was real. What I failed to do, and this is the thing I have to live with, was treat this conversation the way I would have treated any equivalent conversation in my professional life. In 30 years at the city, if a junior colleague had brought me a proposal that involved giving a third-party authority over any account, I would have had that proposal reviewed independently before I moved an inch. That was simply how I worked. Verification was not distrust, it was process. But Quinley was not a junior colleague. She was the woman I shared a home with. She was the person who made me tea and remembered the name of the patient I had mentioned in a passing conversation 6 weeks earlier, and sat with me when I was ill, and asked about my wrong decisions as if they were as worth understanding as my right ones. And so I did not have the document reviewed independently. I read it myself. I asked my questions. I satisfied myself that it was what she said it was. And on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in the office of a Manila solicitor whose letterhead looked entirely legitimate and whose manner gave me no cause for alarm, I signed. The first 6 months after signing were exactly what she had described. The FX costs on my transfers dropped noticeably. The administrative friction of managing finances across 2 countries reduced. She sent me quarterly summaries, professional, clearly laid out, the kind of document that a treasury professional from the city would find satisfying in its structure and transparency. I reviewed them. Everything appeared to match. I say appeared. The shift began so gradually that I did not recognize it as a shift. It began as small latencies. A transfer I had expected to see reflected in my account that took longer than anticipated. An account balance summary that seemed slightly lower than my mental model suggested it should be. Not alarming, not flagged, just slightly off in ways that I attributed to timing and FX fluctuation, because those are real factors that do create exactly that kind of variance. What I was not factoring in was that Quinley was managing those summaries. She was producing the documents that gave me my picture of my own financial position, and a sufficiently skilled finance professional can produce a document that shows you what you expect to see rather than what is actually there. The trigger was external. My UK bank sent me a routine communication about a dormant sub-account, an account I had set up years earlier for a specific purpose that had been resolved, and which I had simply never closed. The balance in that account, which I had not reviewed in perhaps 2 years, was lower than it should have been by an amount that did not fit any transaction I could account for. Not dramatically lower, not catastrophically lower, just wrong in a precise way that my instinct, 30 years of treasury instinct, registered before my conscious mind had fully processed what I was seeing. I did not tell Quinley immediately. I said nothing that evening over dinner. I sat with it overnight, the way I used to sit with a position that felt slightly off before I could articulate why. And in the morning, I started reviewing. Not the summaries she had given me, the source accounts, the original bank statements, which I had direct access to through online banking, because the power of attorney was Philippine-scoped and did not give her authority over my UK accounts. What I found, took me 3 days to fully reconstruct. The Filipina accounts were the mechanism. She had used the authority the power of attorney gave her to establish transfer arrangements between my Philippine accounts and a series of intermediary structures, not to my UK accounts, but away from them. The FX efficiency story had been the architecture of entry. The actual activity was the systematic movement of funds away from my consolidated position over a period of approximately 10 months, in amounts carefully sized to remain below alert thresholds and timed to coincide with genuine FX flows that provided cover. The total, when I reconciled every account I held with a clean audit of what should have been there against what was there, was £295,000. I sat at the desk in the BGC apartment on the third evening of that review, and I looked at the number on my screen, and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected shock. I expected rage. I felt something quieter and colder, the specific feeling of a professional who has found the error in his own work and must now deal with it without the comfort of being able to blame someone else's process. Because I had a process. I had simply not applied it. I had given my professional self entirely to a career and given nothing of it. Not one instrument, not one safeguard, not one moment of verification, to the most consequential financial decision I had made since retirement. I did not confront her that evening. I needed to think about how. There is a version of this story where the confrontation is a scene, where raised voices and slammed doors stand in for the collapse of everything. That was not what happened. What happened was that I waited until we had finished dinner the following evening, and then I set a printed reconciliation on the table between us and said, "I'd like you to help me understand this." She looked at the document. She looked at it for long enough that I knew she understood exactly what it was. Then she looked up. "Where did you get these figures?" she said. "I built them myself from source," I said. "The original account statements, not the summaries." A silence. "There are explanations for the variances," she said. "The FX timing on some of the positions." "Quinley," I said. "Please." She stopped. "I spent 30 years doing this," I said. "I know what legitimate FX variance looks like. This is not that." Another silence. Longer. She looked at the document again, and I watched her face go through something. Not quite calculation, not quite decision, but some intermediate state between the two. The face of someone assessing which version of a story is still viable. "Some of the arrangements were more complex than I initially communicated," she said finally. "I was going to explain them when the positions resolved." "When were they going to resolve?" I said. "It's difficult to give a specific timeline." "Quinley," I said, "how much of this is recoverable?" She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I can make some of it right." "Some," I said. "I need time." I told her I was going to engage a solicitor. Not as a threat. I said it the way you say something that is simply true. She did not argue with it. She nodded in a way that was also assessing, the particular nod of someone deciding what the next stage of their position looks like. She was not there when I woke up the next morning. Her belongings were mostly gone. Her phone went to voicemail. The firm she worked for, when I called the following day, confirmed that she was no longer employed there. She had resigned 2 weeks prior, which I had not known. I engaged a Manila solicitor, a man named Adri Ramon Ilustre, who came recommended by Hugh, who had called in a contact from his own time navigating Philippine legal matters. Adri Ilustre was thorough and did not waste my time with sympathy. He reviewed the power of attorney, reviewed the transaction history I had reconstructed, and gave me his assessment with the directness I needed. The instrument was drafted to appear limited, but was worded in ways that gave significantly broader authority than you likely understood, he said. "It is not impossible to argue that the scope was exceeded, which creates a fraud basis. But I need to be honest with you. The entity structures she used are opaque, and tracing the funds through them is expensive and uncertain." "I understand," I said. "What is your realistic expectation for recovery?" he asked. "I would like to know the honest answer," I said. "Partial," he said. "At best. Depending on whether the structures are still accessible, and whether she has moved the funds further." He filed the civil action. The criminal complaint was also lodged. These processes move on their own clock. which is slow and has nothing to do with the urgency I feel about them. I called Oliver from Manila. He was quiet, in the way I have come to understand means he is frightened. He said, "Dad, what do you need?" I told him I needed him not to come. I needed to handle this myself, and I needed him to know that I was all right. He said he would give me a week before he stopped being patient about that. He was as good as his word. Miriam called from Melbourne on her usual Sunday. I told her before she had a chance to ask how I was. She was less quiet than Oliver, she cried, which I had not expected, and which undid me more than anything else in those weeks. Not because she was upset, but because the sound of it reminded me that what I had lost was not only money, it was the image my children had of me as someone who did not make this kind of mistake. And I had been carrying that image for them for long enough that its loss felt like its own particular grief. "I don't blame you," she said, when she had composed herself. "I just want you to come home." "Soon," I said. "Not yet." I stayed in Manila for another 2 months, working with attorney Illustre and a financial forensics specialist he brought in. A woman named Miss Patricia Ong, who was meticulous and impressive, and who managed to trace portions of the funds through 2 of the intermediary structures before the trail went cold. We recovered, through those 2 structures, approximately £31,000. The rest is subject to the civil proceedings and may or may not materialize into anything real. Hugh came over several evenings during those 2 months. He brought food and the particular companionship of someone who does not try to fix what cannot be fixed, and does not pretend that the thing that happened was smaller than it was. He said once, "The part that's hard to sit with is that she was good, wasn't she? Not just clever, actually good at it." "Yes," I said. "That's the honest version," he said. "She knew what she was doing from very close to the beginning, and she was patient." He was right. Looking back with what I now know, I can see the patience of it. The 8 months before any financial conversation was introduced, the months of the power of attorney appearing to function exactly as described, the summaries that gave me a satisfying picture of my own position, the careful, graduated construction of trust that preceded every stage of the extraction. This was not impulsive. It was a plan, built around a specific understanding of how a specific kind of man processes risk. And the understanding was accurate. She had understood that I was someone who trusted professional competence, that I responded to precision and thoroughness, that the thing most likely to lower my guard was not flattery or emotional need, but the simple, sustained experience of being in the presence of someone who thought clearly and worked carefully. She had given me that experience, consistently, for over 2 years, and then she had used the trust it built to hand her a document that gave her access to everything. The thing I keep returning to is not the document itself. It is the conversation that preceded it. The specific framing, efficiency, timing, FX management, limited scope, that I heard through the ears of my professional self, rather than the ears of the person I was to her. She had known which set of ears to speak to. She had known because I had told her. In a conversation about a bad decision I had made in 2009, I had explained exactly how a risk that I had categorized as unlikely had undone a careful position. I had explained my analytical framework to her, and she had filed it and used it. She asked about the wrong decisions. I thought she was learning from me. I came home to London in late autumn. Not to Putney. The flat is gone, and I have taken a smaller place in Chiswick that I am still not quite used to. The financial position is adjusted but sustainable. The pension is untouched. The investment portfolio, which she never had access to, is intact. What she took was liquid savings and the accessible Filipina accounts. Painful, significant, but not the end of everything. I want to be precise about that, because precision still matters to me. Oliver came down from Edinburgh for a weekend in November. We went for a long walk along the river at Kew. The kind of walk where you don't look at each other much, but you cover the real ground anyway. He asked me what I had learned that I hadn't known before. I had been thinking about that question since before he asked it. I said, I already knew everything I needed to know to protect myself from this. I knew the instruments, I knew the mechanisms, I knew the risks. What I didn't know was that the same analytical habits that make a person good at protecting other people's assets can be turned against them when they apply those habits only to what feels like a professional situation. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what feels professional and what's actually safe aren't always the same thing." "No," I said, "they're not." What Quinley understood, and what I did not, until it was too late, was that my professional discipline was not a shield in this context. It was a channel. She knew that if she spoke to me in the right register, I would process what she said through frameworks that were robust in professional settings and blind in personal ones. She gave me a financial rationale, and I evaluated it financially. She gave me a technical answer, and I assessed it technically. I never once asked the question that sits underneath the technical questions. What does this person want, and is what they want aligned with what I want? I had asked that question about counterparties for 30 years. I had never thought to ask it about the person making me tea. I am back to a version of the solitary life I had before Manila, which is both more manageable than it was and more clearly understood. I know what it is now. I know what it costs when you try to resolve it in the wrong direction. That knowledge does not make it comfortable, but it makes it honest, and honest is a thing I can work with. Miriam calls every Sunday. Oliver calls midweek when he remembers. I have lunch occasionally with Hugh, who is still in Manila and who remains one of the more useful people I know. Aderty Illustre updates me on the civil proceedings when there is something to report, which is less often than I would like and more often than I expected. I have not signed anything without independent review since March of that year. Not a tenancy agreement, not a standing order amendment, not a service contract. The habit of verification, which I had somehow concluded did not apply to my private life, has been reinstated without exception. It should not have taken £295,000 to reinstate it. But it has been reinstated, and it will not lapse again. There is a thing that happens to people who spend long careers in risk management. They develop a category error that is invisible to them from the inside. They come to believe that their professional discipline protects their whole life, that the habits of caution and verification that they apply 8 hours a day somehow persist outside those hours, that the man who reads the fine print at work will naturally read the fine print at home. He does not. The professional discipline is a professional habit. It stays at the office, and the man who goes home is often a much less careful person than the man who was in the boardroom, more tired, more human, more in need of the thing that professional discipline is specifically not designed to provide. What he needs at home is not better analysis, it is better self-knowledge, and those are entirely different things, built through entirely different means, and you cannot substitute one for the other, no matter how good you are at the first. I signed a power of attorney in a solicitor's office in Manila on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Quinley made tea. I drank it and felt, for a moment, like a man who had built something settled. That is the truest thing I can tell you about how it happened. Not that I was foolish, not that I was ignorant, but that I was a careful man who had finally, in what I thought was the right circumstances, decided to stop being careful. That decision cost me £295,000, and the version of my retirement I had planned. What it gave me in return is harder to name, harder to value, but it is there. Cleaner than the money was, quieter, and in its own way more durable. I know, now, exactly where the gap was. That is worth something. I am still working out exactly what.